time out of market, exit costs, entry fees, and so on. But the first step in the super switching advice is to determine whether the client's goals are able to be met by their existing fund. And this will require an investigation of the current fund's features, using software, contacting the product provider, and so on. And again, I'll say that the tip really is that the more detailed the client's goals are, the easier it is to show the basis for a switch. So looking at the slide for an example of that, you can see the one with the cross there is one goal that that I have seen from time to time is one goal that the SOA states is that you want a super fund that allows diversification. Now that's okay, but it's not really specific because in most cases a lot of super funds will allow diversification to some extent. What would be better is something like the first one with the tick there, a fund that allows greater diversification than your current super fund's model portfolios. So you can see a bit more qualification of what that diversification actually means. And in terms of product features, you might have a chat with a client and advisors tell me that this is getting more important to clients, but a fund that allows direct share investments and maybe also online access to your account. So clients want to have a bit more, maybe a bit more control, a bit more flexibility, some different bells and whistles. If that's the case and that comes out in your conversation, putting that into the client's goals, you can see that it's going to be much easier to show how the recommended fund, the 2 fund, achieves those goals rather than if we just use that first example, that a fund that allows diversification. The reasonable basis is going to be easier to show if the goals are more specific. So a couple of other examples might be, a generic goal would be you'd like to accumulate enough money in super for your retirement. A tailored and more specific goal that I think is a lot better is you'd like a super fund that provides you with the following features: online access, visibility into the underlying investments, ability to rebalance, a TTR option, direct shares, retirement income of $50,000 a year from 2014, things of that specific nature. And I know that it's going to depend on what fund the client's in and what they're, how engaged they are and how savvy they are in relation to their super and what features it has and what features are available out in the market. But you can also help clients with that by educating them as well, without necessarily guiding them to a particular product, but providing them with information about generic fund features or some other features that are available that may suit their needs is okay as well. But again, file notes are really good and specific detail in the statements of advice. So like I said, the more specific, the easier it is to show that the from fund did not meet the client's objectives. So once you've worked out what the client wants, the next step should be checking if the current super fund can meet that need. If not, then a replacement super fund needs to be recommended to meet the client's goals. So again, something like SuperSolver can help out here, or reasonable basis, PDS, and so on. If you do use a software program to investigate and compare super funds, it's also a good idea to keep copies of the research that you do undertake on the file. You may, some of them are actually quite client friendly, so you may want to include them, as an appendix or in the SOA. That's up to you. But it does go a long way to showing the lengths you went through to actually compare the super funds. So keep that on the client file or store them electronically or something like that. If it's something you do manually, file notes are also good. So these file notes will provide a strong basis for your advice and can be very helpful in the event of a complaint. In reviewing a number of SOAs recently, we've seen that the basis for switching advice has not necessarily been demonstrated sufficiently. That's one of the reasons that we're going through this session this morning. It's usually not pretty easy, but it can usually be demonstrated that the advice is appropriate, but the SOA and the client file is really the record of that advice and needs to clearly show that the advice was appropriate. Having to go into, be questioned or go into a lot of extra detail in order to show that the advice is appropriate and answer questions from us and so on, probably demonstrates that the file's not strong enough on its own. So really the SOA needs to show how the advice is appropriate to the client. One thing I will point out here is be careful not to use product features as a basis for a switch where they also appear in the from fund. So if you're saying to a client, a benefit of this switch will be, I don't know, that you get direct access to shares, or you've got the access or the ability to choose from 150 or 200 underlying managed funds, keep in mind or check what the from fund actually provides as well, because you want to make sure that that's a point of difference. ASIC's actually said that using a product feature as a basis for a switch where it's also a feature of the existing fund could be or is potentially misleading, and you certainly don't want to be providing information to a client that could be potentially misleading. So in this case, just looking at the slide, the goal you can see is quite quite detailed, saying you require an appropriate investment which is also cost efficient and a flexible avenue for your retirement needs. And the advice stated that what it provided was greater diversification through use of a core satellite investment model for your fund, but also provides a more proactive investment service. So there is the comparison between the to and from funds there, and also stated that the total ongoing fees will be somewhat lower. It's a small, I think it's a reasonably small amount here. Oh, it's a very small amount per annum lower, but it is actually saying you're going to have better better features, and that links back to the flexible avenue for retirement needs, and also the ongoing fees will meet that cost efficiency requirement. So you can see a link between the advice and the client's goals. The final unique piece of the puzzle for super switching advice is the ongoing cost comparison. And on the next few slides, I'll show some examples of those. But the idea is that the client receives information showing the cost from and the to funds. And really, when I look at an SOA, what I'm looking for is a like-for-like comparison. And I'll show you what those look like in a couple of moments. Like I said before, as with any replacement product advice, take care to investigate and explain to the client any impacts or lost benefits. And I guess the big one is to look for is insurance attached to the super fund, because you really don't want to recommend a switch and the client loses insurance cover, especially if their circumstances mean that there are difficulties in obtaining the same cover again, or the same cover at the same cost, or even any cover at all, or that they don't get any cover and a claim event happens. Once that has failed to be taken into consideration and the client's lost that cover and it wasn't pointed out to them, it's really hard to defend any liability for that, and the client's really put in a bad position. So I won't go through all these cost comparisons in detail, mainly because the cost comparisons are done pretty well in SOAs, especially when advisors are using software like Xplan or Midwinter. What I will just highlight the second one there, which gives the idea of when I'm talking about that like-for-like comparison. So the scenario is the client is consolidating a number of existing funds into one new fund, and what you would compare here is the ongoing costs of the consolidated amount using the cheapest from fund versus the to fund. So in this case, the client's got 10,000 in ING, 50k in CBUS, and 40,000 in Navigator, and the advisor has recommended consolidate that into a NetWealth Super App. What would you do in the comparison? The comparison would look like applying a like-for-like scenario. So what the advice says is that consolidate the super into one fund. So what we're going to look at is what we're going to show is what that would look like consolidated into one of the existing funds. And I think for the purposes of a comparison, the best thing to do is to show that 100,000 using the client's